In this second session, we'll want to be looking at what happened in the church from the time of Pentecost up until the time and into the time of the Reformation. And on the transparency, you will notice a timeline that is divided into eras, and then a few things in those eras that we'll want to note and become familiar with that so that we understand the dynamics and events and shifts of the 16th century when our forefathers started the third wing of the Reformation. So with that, we'll want to start now on the timeline, and from the timeline draw a lot of the input for this session. You'll notice that first era is called the Ante-Nicene era. Ante meaning in Latin before. Anti, of course, means against, but ante means before, or the pre-Nicene era, you could say. Or some have called it the pristine Christian era. And then you have dated 313, an event that actually was about 14 years in the making, and that would be called the Constantinian change, or the changes that happened under Constantine. When beginning in 311, you had very major changes from 311 to 325, those 14 years of time. But generally on a timeline, and I would agree with this, that 313 represents about as accurately as any time the major shift in the church's self-image and its theological shifts being put in place, at least, in 313. Now, in the case of the early church, this can't be said with total accuracy of every city where Christianity flourished, or of all the time from the Pentecost to Constantine. But as a general rule, you could say these four things that you note there on the timeline about the early church that especially apply, while many other things could be said. These four especially apply to our own history and our own view of what the church is like, and ought to be like, if it's a true New Testament church. And that is the idea of a believer's church, or you could say a free church. Free doesn't mean they don't take up offerings, but it means that we are untampered by or unhitched to the social and political powers. It's separate from the socio-political and consisted of believers only. Whereas later, and in the minds of many, the church is not necessarily a believer's church, and we'll say more about that later. They also had a very clear two-kingdom concept. It was in their minds us Christians and them non-Christians, very consistently that way, and it was heightened at times of persecution. I used to think earlier that probably all of that period of time, 270, 80 years, that the church would have been persecuted. But that's not actually true. There were periods of time when there was relative peace for the Christians, at least in large segments of the Roman world. But there were also times of really horrible persecution. But there was enough persecution, but even apart from persecution, they had a clear sense that to be a born-again Christian identified you separately from those who were not born again and as members of another kingdom. So that you had a very clear two-kingdom concept, the kingdoms of this world, the kingdoms of Satan, the kingdoms of the non-Christians, and the kingdom of God, the kingdom of Christ, the church, in this particular era. They also had a very clear sense of being a persecuted minority. Even when they were not being jailed or martyred, they had second-rate citizenship. They were actually accused of atheism because they didn't believe in the gods of the Romans. The Romans had adopted the Greek religion, and they were basically Grecian in their religious and even political outlook. The Romans propagated a lot and continued a lot of what the previous rulers had, and that was in their religion, the Greek mystery religions. Now, mystery is not meaning that, like we sometimes use it, something that can't be or isn't known. Can't be known or isn't known. It doesn't mean that. It's actually taken from the Greek word that they used, the Greeks and the Romans used, of when there was, in their minds, a response from a god or goddess. They called that a mysterion. A mysterion, we would say in English, a mysterion. And so from that, they named it the mystery religions. Back in 1971, we were on a tour of Greece with J. Otis Yoder and about, 32 others, I believe, or 32 of us, did a bus tour for 5 days. And we wound up at one point at Delphi, Greece, where the Olympic Games originated. And the guide, a lady from the Greek Orthodox Church, she took us to the temple in ancient Delphi, where they had done a good bit of excavation. And there's where I had a first-hand exposure to what I had read about before, but became just a really sad, poignant, very impressive experience to stand on the floor of a pre-Christian era temple, probably built in the 3rd century BC. And the mosaic on the floor, done in stone, polished smooth, in little pieces about 1 by 2 inches, something like that. The mosaic on that floor still looked in many places good enough to be used today, although it had been buried under some earth for a period of time. But they had that all cleared out, and some of the foundation and edges were there, and a few pillars, so that you could imagine what, and they had an artist's drawing of what that temple may have looked like. And in the middle of that area of worship, where the worshipers would sit on the outside, and the center of the temple had an octagon-shaped base for an altar. And there, in about a 4-tiered altar with a fire pit at the top, there they would seek for what they called the oracles of God, or the oracles of the gods. As a case in point, if there was the threat of war, or if their king wanted to declare a war on an enemy, they would seek a word from the god of war, and they would take the prettiest virgins, usually 14 to 16-year-old girls. And a priest of ancient Greece could be walking the streets and see a beautiful girl, and he could say, "You are to be a temple virgin," and she nor her parents had anything to say to it. And she was taken to the temple and determined that she was for sure a virgin, and then she would be presented to the god of war when they were seeking a word from God, a mysterion, and they would have a circle of maybe a dozen virgins sitting on that first tier at bench height. Then the priests and a high priest of the Grecian religion would be drinking a drugged kind of liquor and go through the liturgies that were prescribed and do dancing to the beat of drums. And finally, at a given point, the high priest, supposedly being inspired and moved by the god, would close his eyes and lunge at one of those girls. And of course the other girls would scatter, but he would grab one of the girls, the priests would help him. They would restrain her, lay her on the next layer of the slab there of the altar, and they would cut her jugular and bleed her to death, catching the blood for a sacrifice to the god of war, if no one began to speak. If someone began to speak before the priest lunged at one of the girls, they said, the God has answered and speaks through the girl. And they had 2 or 3 recorders, people who would write in a shorthand form as fast as they would speak. And they would write the message from the gods, called the oracles of God. Remember that term taken from the Greek where Paul asks, what advantage do the Jews have? He said their advantage is that to them were delivered the oracles of God, the messages of God to man. I remember standing there thinking, I wonder how many of those girls died because no one spoke quick enough. Or how many times did they save their lives by saying something, but it wasn't from God or the gods. And then I was convicted in my heart. We have Bibles at our disposal, many of them. And would it be possible that a Greek virgin in the day of judgment would look at Christians who let dust settle on their Bibles, or who read it but didn't obey it, didn't follow its teachings? They died to hear from God, and we live without hearing from God. And our forefathers made that really big commitment to hear from God, whatever the cost. And that's the challenge I'd want to leave with the early church now. They did it as well. And when our forefathers, just looking at the timeline now, when our forefathers back in the 16th century, that last block is the last era is the Reformation era. And when our forefathers from that era, who were educated men, the first several generations were mostly educated men, educated for the Catholic priesthood and so on. When they looked back over history, and they did know history relatively well, when they looked back over that, they wanted to reinstitute the kind of Christianity that existed prior to Constantine. And they talked about, they wrote about some of the very things, like I have a list of 4 things that Constantinianism introduced into Christian thought and theology. Again, that's not a complete list, but it addresses some of the basic issues, and specifically as it applies to us and our Anabaptist persuasion, our Anabaptist worldview, and scriptural commitments. So going then to the end of that era, that first era, they had a relative peaceful time from about 250 to 295. So for a whole generation and a half, they had relative peace, and they began to build church houses. And were becoming more accepted in the culture, but the Roman world was also facing a lot of negatives. And the new emperor, Diocletian, at that point, became persuaded that the gods were angry at Rome for tolerating the atheists among them, meaning those who did not believe in their 365 gods, and the unknown God. Remember that story in the book of Acts where Paul made known to the philosophers on Mars Hill the unknown God. He had seen the altar to him. And what happened was that Diocletian then began to persecute Christians and Jews in about 295, right up to his death in 311, late 310, early 311. And then you had two young men who were cousins, who had generals in the army and senators in the Senate behind them, the two opposite young men, Constantine being one and his cousin, and they couldn't have two emperors. And so what they did, as they solved political problems back there, I wouldn't recommend it for America, but what they decided to do was to have a battle where the soldiers loyal to Constantine and those loyal to his cousin would have a set time at a set place where they would meet. In history, it's called the Battle of the Milvan Bridge that took place in 311. And you had this little creek down here and a slope on both sides, and the armies gathered there the day before the set battle. And when the trumpet blew to announce the time for battle, they were to go after the other person's emperor. And as soon as one of the emperors was killed, the trumpet would blow again, and then the surviving emperor becomes the emperor. That would be a new way to get a president in America, wouldn't it? But that's what they did then, and that's what happened with Constantine. Constantine, we don't know how he felt about persecution prior to this, but the night before the battle, realizing that his cousin had more soldiers than he, and he had more chariots. The chariots were the personnel carriers or battle tanks of that time. And realizing that his cousin actually had him outnumbered in materiel and men, he went to pray. Of course, he was Grecian, Roman, and he went out to be by himself outside or on the edge of the encampment, and the sun was setting. And supposedly written by him or written for him as he dictated it, he said like this, and I quote, "As I prayed, suddenly I saw emblazoned on the setting sun the sign of the Nazarene." The Nazarene was a common reference at that point to Jesus, not Nazarite, but Nazarene. And the sign, the primary sign, was the sign of the cross. And Christians then already did some of the genuflection on themselves of the cross. And so when he saw apparently a cross emblazoned on the setting sun, and he heard these words, "In this sign conquer." Now I don't know what happened there. I wasn't there, I'm not that old, but God is the God of history. I don't know if that actually happened, or if it was of God or of Satan. I really don't know. But that's what he claimed happened, and what happened then was that he went running back to his commander's tent, and he told his commanding officers, "The Nazarene is also a god. And he spoke to me. I had a mysterion." And it's interesting that later in history, by the 5th century, the Catholic Church, the universal church that emerged out of Constantinianism, actually translated the word mysterion, Greek, to Latin sacrament, sacrament. Very interesting little thing that happened in language and etymology that is also doctrinal. And again, a little more about that later. But what happened then was that the soldiers went out, well, that night yet, he made the decree in the camp, and the word spread that one of the gods spoke to our leader. We're going to win because the gods are on our side. And they began by order to paint crosses on their shields and their chariots. I have wondered what soldiers and centurions thought and felt when they were painting crosses and they themselves had jailed, arrested, and even executed Christians for their commitment to the Jesus of the cross. And now they're painting crosses on Roman shields and chariots. But they went to battle the next day, and with a lot of zeal and fervor, they went after Constantine's cousin, and they killed him before the other soldiers could kill Constantine. And the trumpet blew, and Constantine was the sole emperor. His first official known act was called the Edict of Toleration. He wrote an edict saying that all the governors throughout all of Rome should immediately stop persecuting Christians. And the runners went, and their stagecoach system, they had a good mail system back then. They didn't have internet, email, but they got the word out quickly and stopped persecution. Then in 313, Constantine made a second very important edict in which he said to the Roman world, to the Roman people, that he has embraced Christianity. It's interesting, he wasn't baptized. He refused baptism until on his deathbed years later. But he said, I have embraced Christianity, and he urged all the Romans to embrace Christianity. And he started a program where with state money they rebuilt or built anew and larger churches that his predecessor, Diocletian, had either confiscated or destroyed. So you have a case where the state begins to build churches for the Christian church. And you have overnight, you have the primary bishops of the 5 major cities where Christians were, Alexandria, Egypt, Caesarea, Rome, Constantinople, and Ephesus. Those bishops gathered at Rome and worked with Constantine to set about and set up a Christian world. And they really believed that is to be a fulfillment of the prophecy made by Isaiah in Isaiah 11, where he talks about the ingathering of the Jews, and he says some very interesting things there for our day, when he said, I will set my hand again the second time to gather the dispersed of Israel from the 4 corners of the world. That did not happen after the Chaldean disbursement under Nebuchadnezzar. That was from the east. He said, I will set my hand again the second time and gather dispersed of Israel from the 4 quadrants, east, west, north, south of the world. And that began happening in the 1890s and culminated in the state of Israel becoming a state in 1948. I am obviously betraying my eschatology at that point. But one of the reasons that early on I did embrace that particular eschatology without some of the wild-eyed projections, I'm embarrassed how many antichrists premillennialists have had over the years. I don't identify with that. But in any case, one of the reasons is that as I studied early history, I detected that the majority of the leaders of the early church were millennialists, called chiliasts then. Chilia in Greek means a millennium or 1,000 years, and millennia in Latin means 1,000. So it's simply a synonym between Greek and Latin. But then after Constantine, even Augustine himself, after his conversion, he says for 9 years he was a chiliast. And then he became an amillennialist. And that's the Catholic eschatology, basically. I'll say a bit more about that later if time permits in a later session. But for our purposes now, what happened was that by design, the bishops that led the church at that point, and that's when the Roman bishop, because of that being the political seat of power, became the dominant bishop of the 5. And as they added other larger cities and more bishops, he became the head bishop. And by the 5th century, you have the first actually elected pope, or the papa, the father of the church, who becomes, at that point, became the vicar, or some pronounce it vicar, both are acceptable, I guess, of Christ, meaning that he was on earth instead of Christ, which led to a very bad doctrine for the Roman Catholic Church that we'll talk about a bit later. Note now, under the Constantinian change on the timeline there, I note that the Constantinian change introduced 4 things, and I'd like to just go over those 4 with you briefly. It introduced sacralism, which is simply a big word, and don't blame me for these words. And I'm not going to have a final tomorrow and do a test to see how well you retained all this. That might be a good idea, though, come to think of it. But no, we won't do that. We won't fail anyone. But don't worry about the terms if you're not into learning new words and adding to your vocabulary. But that is a good idea, to add to your vocabulary. I tell students the 11th commandment, if there were one, would be that if you run into a new word, either you hear it, see it, or read it, you look it up and find out what it means. It does add to your intelligence, and it broadens the programming in your computer, and so on. Anyway, sacralism is the idea of a state or official religion. Christianity became the religion of Rome overnight, practically. And by overnight, because they did not have the means of communication we now have, overnight is less than a generation. And it really did happen that quickly that the church became, Christianity became the official religion of Rome. And they were baptizing people by the thousands and tens of thousands. In 325, Constantine declared that all of his soldiers must be baptized Christians. They were hiring them, And so they baptized them en masse. And they were hiring Germans back then already, because 2,000 years ago, well, that's 1,700 years ago, we Germanic people were already good fighters. In the Second World War, American commanders did not initiate a battle with the Nazis, the Germans, unless they had a 1/3 man and material advantage. Because if they were evenly matched, they got whipped. Reminds me of when I was an Amish boy. There were 2 Mennonites and 2 Amish boys in my class, 4 of us. And one day on a snowy day, the teacher told us to go out and play in the snow. And 11 English boys challenged us Nazis, and that's what they called us. That was in 3rd grade during World War II. Because we spoke a German dialect and our older brothers didn't join the army, they called us yellow-bellied Nazis. And they wanted a fight, a snowball fight between the Nazis and the Allies. We had time to build a little fort and a little stock of snowballs. All four of us Amish and Mennonites were farm boys. Only a few of them were. And the Nazis won that day. Yeah. We weren't very nice, but we won that day. But back then they were already hiring Germans. Could be that several of our great-grandpappies were in the Roman army. And they were told they had to be baptized Christians to stay in the army. And it was an attractive thing because they were paid about double the wage of an unskilled laborer. Plus they had better clothes and better living quarters, better food, better way of life. And they had to do very little fighting in that era. So they let themselves be baptized. I read of one account where they had two bishops next to each other with enough room for 4 soldiers to march between them abreast at full march. And they kept the water supplied, and the bishops would dip their fingers into the water and sprinkle them and repeat over and over again, I baptize you in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, amen. And then repeat it again, and just kept baptizing them by the thousands, and made the Roman army a Christian army overnight. When prior to that, and you'll notice the last thing I note here is that they embraced Christian militarism. I'll come back to the other two now that I've started on this one, but when they embraced militarism, it was a total 180 turn from before. Because in my own studies, from reading the early fathers, I had not detected that there was one exception where they would baptize a soldier, or one who was a soldier, who wasn't a soldier but was a baptized member of the church, was allowed to join the army. So if you were in the church, you couldn't join the army. If you were saved as a soldier, you couldn't join the army. Couldn't join the church, I'm sorry. And so my impression was that there were no exceptions. But I wasn't confident enough about the thoroughness of my research to say that. I did say that's my impression. And then, of all people, a Roman Catholic Jesuit monk lecturing at Ohio State made the statement, and he was pacifist. And he said Christian pacifist, not humanitarian or humanist, but Christian pacifist, and that's a good word, good way of saying it as well. But he said the early church before Constantine did not tolerate anyone to be a soldier and a Christian, a member of the church. No exceptions, he said. So I've quoted him for many years, probably 25 years, and sometimes to non-Mennonites. And no one has ever shown me an exception. Later, when we talk about non-resistance, I will give you one who tried an exception, which really was a bad, bad illustration, and it backfired on him. But we'll talk about that one later. Let's go on to the numbers 2 and 3 here as to the changes that happened there, where sacramentalism became now the soteriology. That word simply means the way they understood how we are saved. Whenever you see ology on the end of a word, it means the study of, or it can be used to mean one's position regarding something. So soter or soter in Latin means savior. So it's literally saviorology or salvationology. It's the study of how we are saved. So their whole soteriological premise changed in a generation there, where not everyone, but most, went along with this, that what made you Christian was the sacrament of baptism. And what keeps you Christian and gives you the life of Jesus is to actually ingest the consecrated bread and wine. Now, it went into the 5th and 6th centuries before it became dogma with them. But with the Catholic Church today, it is still dogma that a duly, and I quote now, a duly ordained priest in apostolic succession has the authority of God to transmit the grace of God to man through the sacraments. And the Catholic opposition to divorce is not so much on the basis of the teachings of Scripture as it is that they believe marriage is a sacrament. And to undo a sacrament, the only one who can do that is Jesus. And Jesus has his vicar on earth, that's the Pope. So you have to have a papal annulment of a marriage to remain a good Catholic in good standing. If you want to divorce your wife, you have to make your case through your pastor, the bishop, and finally to the Pope, where he annuls your marriage. And then you can remarry and be a communicant Catholic. That's sacramentalism, gone to seed, as it were, where the sacrament arbitrarily, if administered by a duly ordained priest. What they mean by that is someone in succession from Peter, whom they have crowned as the first pope. Peter doesn't know about it, but they made him the first pope, and popes ever since that, when actually in history, Pope Leo was the first one that they actually made pope. But then they built the papacy back to Peter from Leo with particular bishops that they gave that honor to and that assignment to. That's sacramentalism. We are sacramentarian. Sacramentarianism is the position that the sacraments are symbolic and do not arbitrarily convey grace. However, I'm grieved at the fact that we are so sacramentarian in some circles that we don't expect to be blessed when we're baptized. We don't expect to be blessed when we take part in communion. It's just a symbol. Well, maybe I'm too critical. But we really ought to expect to be blessed. And when we lay hands on someone in ordination, it's not in apostolic succession. But Paul did say twice to Timothy, referred to the gift that is in him that was given him by the laying on of hands. There is an expectation of grace in the sacraments, we call them ordinances, and in the laying on of hands and ordination. Well, that's my 2 cents worth on that one. Let's go on to the third one here. Sacerdotalism, that's as bad as it sounds, if not worse. The word sacer or sacer in Latin means priest. It's the priesthood of the ministry. And that's shifted in one generation where the spiritual leaders were called elders, pastors, shepherds, bishops, all of those terms, and ministers. But now they began to call them priests. And the local parish priest was called priest, and then you had a second ordination for bishop. Actually, second ordinations happened in the 3rd century before Constantine, but there's no real biblical basis for a second ordination from minister to bishop. And then from bishop they went to city bishop, called monarchical bishop, and then they had archbishops, and from archbishops cardinals, so that finally you have from the layman in the pew up to the Pope, you have 7 layers or 7 steps of hierarchy in the Roman Catholic Church, patterned after the 7 political levels in Rome politically in that time. So you see the connection there with the political and the religious happening there. So that's basically what happened. And in brief, should I run out of time, let me say at this point, what happened then in the 16th century was that Luther and Zwingli and Calvin, the Protestants who left Catholicism, well, they initially didn't intend to leave. They wanted to reform the church. But the Catholics excommunicated them and persecuted them, so they had to automatically did become a separate movement. But the Protestants were trying to reform the church, hanging on to sacralism, the official religion, hanging on to militarism, and among the Lutherans, at least a quasi, kind of halfway, sacramentalism. And then for the Zwinglian, the Swiss movement, now called the Reformed movement, well, it was early on called Reformed, that movement would share our sacramentarian position that the sacraments are simply symbols of grace, but don't arbitrarily convey grace. And so you had that kind of thing happening in the Reformation in trying to reform the church. Our forefathers made it clear that they saw the Constantinian change as the fall of the church. Several of them in their writings actually referred to the Catholic Church as the fallen church and the Constantinian change as the fall of the church. And from their perspective, they were not reforming the church, but they wanted to reinstitute pristine, ante-Nicene Christianity, which was a very radical step and one deemed so threatening to the Catholic and Protestant churchmen and magistrates, threatening because in their minds you simply could not have a viable culture, society, without a common religion. And they thought after all these years, plus it blew their eschatology and a lot of other things, so they wanted to hang on to this idea of a universal religion, to where even as Isaiah prophesied, which means this has never happened in history yet, where in that same prophecy he said, "You will no longer say to your neighbor, 'Know the Lord,' for everyone will know the Lord, from the least to the greatest, and the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea." And the last time I looked over an ocean, it was pretty thorough. The waters cover the sea. That has not yet happened. It is still an unfulfilled prophecy. But it was deemed by Augustine to happen. I've said already, if Augustine could come back to life and review history, he would seek out the Mennonite church and want to join. No, I don't know if he would or not. But he would know that he was wrong, because he really believed that the time would come when everyone would be Christian, baptized as a baby, confirmed as an adolescent, and spiritual life maintained through the sacrament of communion, the Mass, and guaranteed of eternal life because of those sacraments. Duly ordained priests performed on them, and the grace of God was given them. When I was first saved at the age of 15, one of my friends from school was a Syrian Catholic. His parents had immigrated from Syria. And John was one of those first burdens of my heart to lead to the Lord. Unfortunately, I did not succeed. And he lived a sinful, terribly wicked life, dissipated his health, and died in his middle years. As far as I know, still clinging to the hope that he would make heaven eventually, but he would have to go through purgatory because of the way he lived. And that's what happened in that dark era, in the Middle Ages there, where you see also the rise of Islam. I don't have time to talk a lot about that, but that gives you the time frame in which the Islamic movement started in the 7th century. But in that time frame, you had a number of things develop in Catholicism that we now know as kind of major doctrines and dogma of Catholicism. One of them was that they ran into this problem. If you baptize a baby and that makes the baby Christian, And that baby grows up even as an adolescent to go to communion and confession and do penance, but lives a wicked life and dies in sin. What do you do with them? You either invalidate the baptism and the sacrament of communion that supposedly gave them the life of Jesus to actually ingest Jesus when they take the consecrated bread and wine. So what do you do with them? And it's unclear because it was a process. It's unclear, you can't put a date on it, but it was being taught for a while and then became dogma after a while. Dogma in the Catholic vocabulary would be the essentials of the faith that must be believed by the faithful. That's dogma. Well, it became dogma in the latter part of the Dark Ages there, before the Crusades, that if you died without enough merit to make it directly to heaven, then you would have to go to a place of purging called purgatory. And that's a mini hell, a mini temporary lake of fire, where you suffer until, and this is their wording, you make satisfaction for your sins. Then you can go to heaven. Later, when they were building even before the Crusades and in the Crusades era, some priests would offer to do special prayers and masses and light candles at the church for people who were dying and had lived a wicked life. And they would promise that would shorten their time in purgatory. And it became known as an indulgence, where you could live a wicked life, and then when you were afraid of dying, you would simply pay money to the church or give real estate or art treasures to the church, and the priests would then see to it that you wouldn't have to spend a lot of time in purgatory. Conversely then, someone who lived a really good life and did a lot of good ministry, the late Mother Teresa, and who would fault her for her life and ministry? But they're putting her on a fast track to sainthood, which means when she becomes a declared saint by the Catholic Church, then the Catholic faithful can pray to her in heaven, and she can hear their prayers, and she can take their requests to Jesus. Or you can also pray to Mary, and she can take the requests. So the saints become intermediaries for the faithful to pray to for favors, especially in relation to the sufferings of purgatory. And that's what led then to Martin Luther's kind of the last step to push him to start the Reformation, was when John Tetzel, a monk, came to Wittenberg and was selling not only the indulgences for the dead, but also indulgences for the living, where if you wanted to paint the town red in sin and do your penance ahead of time, you could give money to the church to build what is today's Peter's Basilica in Rome. They were building that in the 16th century, and they were raising money to build that. And the Pope declared that they could sell indulgences for the living, where you do your penance before you're sinning, which the church doesn't do anymore to their credit, but they were doing it then. Plus you could also, if you had a loved one that you were afraid was in purgatory after he died, you could pay money. And Tetzel said, as soon as the money jingles in the coffers of the Pope, the soul flies free from purgatory. And that was the last straw that made Luther sit down and write his 95 disagreements with Catholicism and put them up on the bulletin board of the University of Wittenberg, called the Door of Wittenberg Church. And started the discussion of those issues and sparked a revolution that we now call the Reformation. But I won't have time to go into more detail of that now. Let's just pass over the Crusades rather quickly with this little bit of information. The Crusades were basically a war between the Muslim East and the Christian West, which is not totally unlike the dynamics of the present religious political situation in our world. And what happened was that prior to 1096, there were rather sympathetic rulers in the Holy Lands held by the Muslims that did allow the wealthy of Europe to go to the Holy Land to visit the holy sites, like the birth of Jesus, the birthplace of Jesus in Bethlehem, and the place of the burial, and of course of Golgotha, and so on. But then a little before 1096, there was a new set of political rulers called the Seljuk Turks, who took over the Holy Land, and they cut off the Christian pilgrims from coming into the holy sites. And that angered the Europeans. And the best we can tell, the first crusade was incited by a monk by the name Walter. Don't I like that? And furthermore, he was called Walter the Penniless. I've wondered if there's a connection between the name and the finances, but he was called Walter the Penniless. He would not handle money. He lived off the land. He was what's the name for that kind of monk? But anyway, he lived, mendicant monk, lived off the land, and if people didn't feed him, he didn't eat. And he would not handle money. If someone happened to give money to him and it would fall into his hands, he would just drop it. It would fall to the ground. He began to preach, even though the Catholic Church in their church services had stopped preaching. Some of the monks would preach on the streets. And he began to preach that the Christians ought to rise up against these infidels, throwing the same kind of accusation against the Muslims that the Romans had thrown against the Christians in the early era. And we should rise up against those infidels and drive them out. And so they raised a crusade. The Pope got word of it, and he promised immediate full indulgence. Anyone who died on the crusade would immediately go into paradise, into heaven, and wouldn't have to go through purgatory. And they even emptied the prisons of those willing to join the crusade. It was a terrible debacle. There were 10 major crusades, one of them the Children's Crusade. None of them were really super successful. A few of them for a period of time held some land. But it was a time of 200 years of war between the East and the West, and the Muslims and the Christians. And it wasn't over by the time of the Reformation. If you recall, in the trial of Michael Sattler, he was accused of saying that if he would fight on any side, he would fight on the side of the Muslims. He did not really say that. He just said, in essence, in short, he was saying that it is not as wicked of Muslims whose holy writ tells them they ought to fight, as it is for Christians whose leaders said we should turn the other cheek, for them to fight. And he was right. We agree with him on that one. But those crusades were a very sad, sad time. The Renaissance then, starting after the Crusades, and these eras are imposed by historians today, and I would agree with them as being quite accurate, though. The Renaissance, that's a French word that literally means rebirth. You see the prefix re there, renaissance, the French would say, rebirth. And it was a time of rebirth where you had a good bit of increase in literacy, and the lot of the common people was getting somewhat better. There was a time of some inventions and some discoveries. When did Columbus come to the West? 1492, right? When was the printing press invented? Someone know right off the top of your head, some of you youngsters who did recent Western Civ, Western history? When was the printing press? It's up there, isn't it? So yeah, you can cheat. No, it's not cheating if it's right out there. 1450. So that was late Renaissance. And you'll notice there are two pre-Reformation reformers noted there. And under that, I have listed the basic issues of Anabaptism, which basically address the four issues of change that happened under Constantine in the 4th century there. So what we'll do in the next session then is pick up in discussion of John Huss and John Wycliffe and what led to the Reformation, and go right into the Reformation era, and even the beginnings then of the third wing, which is our movement called Anabaptism. With that, I think we'll wrap up this session and look forward then to picking up with the pre-Reformation reformers in the next session. Bless you all real good.